We welcome you all to the CSE's webinar on protecting floodplains. So floodplains, as we know, they are a natural barrier to the floods. They are a very good ideal recharge. They serve as an ideal recharge mechanism for groundwater recharge, as well as they are home to many flora and fauna. Today we have with us three eminent speakers who will raise the issues and challenges related to the protection of the floodplains. We will try and discuss the solutions and see whether there are any international success stories which India can follow, which can be set as a benchmark. And before we go to other cities, which the eminent speakers will be speaking on, let's have one or two words on Yamuna floodplains because we belong to Delhi and we need to talk about this Yamuna floodplain. As you know, Delhi's urban plan divides Delhi into different zones, and zone which is ecologically sensitive floodplain zone between Wazirabad to Palla. This is the Yamuna floodplain. And according to the master plan of Delhi of 2021, this actually is a zone demarcated as the most ecologically sensitive area, but a land-hungry city has actually set up different artificial structures, and as a result, the flow of the river has been diverted, the floodplain has been encroached, obstructed, and the natural evolution and the extent of the floodplain has been stopped. We have seen several battles in the court which was on erecting temples, big temples, which was hitting the headlines at that point of time. Then we had sports village at that point of time, which was also brought into headlines, and they were all in court. So across several years, we have been fighting for saving this floodplain. And the zone O, which I had actually mentioned from master plan of 2021, it's actually somewhat around 9,700 hectares, out of which 1,600 hectares is underwater. And the remaining 81 hectares is dry. And this is the area which is always encroached due to planned and unplanned illegal or legal buildings that are coming up, and most of it are residential areas with thousands of inhabitants in it. So we had floods last year in July, August. Delhi actually hit the headlines because of the flood water which reached the Supreme Court actually, and the height was almost reaching around more than 200 meters of flood water which we had seen. So it was agreed principally that again that zone O has to be planned in a proper way, and acceptable land use plan has to be in place, which the draft of the 2041 speaks on. But it is not final. And since it is not final, it's still in the grey area, which gives the land mafia the scope to build on more illegal structures, illegal, I should mention the word illegal, coming up. So in that floodplain. So we start today with different speakers, starting from Professor Venkatesh Datta. So Professor Datta, are you there? Maybe we can start with Professor Datta, who will be. Can you switch on?
Good afternoon. Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah, please switch on your camera. So Professor Datta is from School of Earth and Environmental Studies Sciences, Babasaheb Bhimrao Ambedkar University, Lucknow, Uttar Pradesh, who will talk to us on the different rivers which are facing similar issues, which I have discussed for Yamuna. And he will discuss about the different rivers in Uttar Pradesh, and let us understand whether there is any scope of getting back our floodplains, saving the cities from the urban floods, and demarcating a big recharge zones for the cities which are facing plunging groundwater level. So over to you, Professor Datta, if you can share your screen.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for your introductory remark. Let me share my screen. Uh, is it visible? Can you see?
Yeah, let's make it full
Can you see
screen.
the screen? My screen.
Please make it full screen.
So, good afternoon to all the participants. Yeah, yeah. Is it full screen now?
Yes.
So this is a small presentation on what are the challenges and solutions related to encroachment of floodplains. So basically, I have structured my presentation around these six thematic areas. I would also briefly talk about why we need to protect the floodplains and what are the requirement or the operating aspects of floodplain zoning, and few case studies from UP, Lucknow, and the different river basins like Gomti, Ghagra, Rapti, and also the Yamuna River basin, and what are the ways forward on protecting or mapping floodplain, the vast floodplain that we are located currently. So, starting on what exactly is a floodplain, there are different definitions, but if you see topographically, the floodplain is a flat area which lies close to a river or a stream on both sides. But geomorphologically speaking, it is a landform. It is a landform which was composed by the fluvial processes or the processes of a river from large amount of deposition of sediments. We call it unconsolidated depositions of sediments, which have been transported by these river systems in for hundreds of thousands of years. These rivers have been transporting sediment and creating large floodplain on adjacent to these river systems. But hydrologically speaking, these landforms are subject to periodic inundation or flooding. There's a return period, like every 25 year you have a high flood, or 100 year or 50 year, depending upon how frequently you are getting the floods. But if you are modeling a flood, you are interested in the areas which are susceptible to flooding, which are inundated with the land which is inundated by water periodically. So what is the extent of that area? So the best definition would be to look at the model floodplain zoning bill, which was given in 1975. They have defined floodplain as the area which is adjacent to a river or a stream. So two things are required for a river. I always say that it is a free flow and a free flood. We have been saying that flood is bad, but for ecosystem process, flooding is required periodically. Flooding is a natural event. Flooding is vital for geomorphological processes and ecosystem integrity. And floodplains are inseparable from a river. Floodplains are an integral part of a river system. And if you have an active floodplain which are getting inundated periodically, that means you have a healthy river systems, because you have a periodic rejuvenation or replenishment of soil and nutrients. So flooding is required. So free flow and free floods, these are two basic ingredients of a healthy river. And once you have a floodplain, you have a well vegetated floodplain. That means the vegetation is natural and water is spreading across the length and the breadth of the floodplain, so that there is a periodic retention and recharge to the aquifers. Now, these floodplains are formed by the natural process. The rivers would spill into their floodplains when the flow would exceed the bankful discharge. So, whenever there is a bankful discharge, there is a overbank spill from the channel, and the river water would spill on both sides and would make the deposition of the sediments, the coarser sediment, the heavier sediment, would be very close to the bank of the river, and the lighter or the fine sediment would spread to large distance, and would make the lateral sides on both sides of the channel, and would make the vast floodplains from the lateral flow. So, as I have already told you that they are part of the riverine ecosystem, they are inseparable from the river. We only see a flowing water channel and we ignore the floodplains. These floodplains, they are the natural habitat for plants and animals. If we destroy the floodplains, we destroy the natural habitat. They are also the sites to the water filtration and the groundwater recharge. Lot of sediment transport is happening, and these sediment would also filter any contaminants, any nutrients that is coming from the catchment. So water is filtered naturally, and the groundwater recharge is happening naturally. There are also areas which carry the high load of water during extreme events. Yamuna was flooded last year. The we have created uh, colonies and settlements and even games village, the Asian game village within the floodplain. So the river was not able to carry the high discharge. So you have to create that free passage. You have to create that space whenever there is a extreme event, that high discharge is bypassed during the floods. And these are also the sites of social and economic exchange and the growth. As these areas, you have the renewals, you have the hydropowers, you have the agriculture happening, the riverine agriculture is happening, and also the industrial water supply. If you see the hydrographs from a damaged floodplain and the healthy floodplain, what do you see? There is a flood peak getting reduced due to floodplain effect. If you have the healthy floodplain, then there is a natural storage, there is a natural water, flood water, which is spreading across the river, the lateral, the what you call the lateral connectivity on both sides. The floodplain is connected with the river, and there is a healthy floodplain hydrograph. But when you have constructed, you have encroached upon the floodplain, then there would be a lot of the inundation events, and the flood peak is very intense, and there is a sudden runoff which is coming and flooding your floodplain. So rapid urbanization is happening, and unplanned construction is happening within the floodplain. We are encroaching upon the floodplain. We are also disposing solid waste. These are the areas, the low-lying areas, most favored for dumping. And when the floodplain is choked, it will prevent the water going back to the main river channel. Ganga is a main drain, major drain, the master drain. It is connected with many tributaries and smaller feeder streams. So when the feeder streams are choked, when the smaller rivers are choked, then this will even result in large flood. So water clogged floodplains, and there would be the flooding intensity would be high. Similarly, we are also damaging our floodplains due to over abstraction and ill planned water diversion. uh, we are depriving our rivers of minimum ecological flow, and the downstream areas are dry. The floodplains are getting gradually permanently detached, fragmented from the main river channel, and the floodplain is rendered dysfunctional. So when you have dysfunctional floodplain, then there would be higher peak flood water levels during floods, and that is what happening with our major urban areas, major river systems, which where the catchment is urban. So that cumulative impact is on the fluvial ecosystem. The entire alluvial ecosystem is getting hampered. So there is an urgent need to protect the floodplain from the widespread encroachment, from the housing projects, highways project, industries, settlements. They are all coming within the active floodplain. There is also need to have the adequate flows in the rivers, from which is happening due to over allocation from ill-planned diversion. And also there is a rising trend of using river as a sink of solid waste that we have to stop. So floodplains need to be physically.
Sorry, sir, can you unmute yourself? Professor Datta?
Professor Datta, you are on mute. You are on mute. Professor Datta, you are on mute. You are on mute, Professor Datta.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's okay now.
So did you lose some, like, I don't know where we were?
So you were talking about the encroachments and ill-planned
Yeah.
water directions here.
So there is a need to do proper, proper zoning of the floodplain, and we have the international benchmark on proper zoning. We have, if you take the cross section and if you map the 100-year flood period, you have the HFL high flood levels, which is generally marked once in 100 years, then once in 50 years, once in 25 years. So you have in the center is a stream, the channel, and the overbank spill on the terrace 1. This is terrace 2. So T0 is the base of the river, then terrace 1, T1 and T2. And this T1 and T2 is the flood fringe. And together this terrace T1 and T2, that is the entire flood fringe, would make your flood plain. So the idea is to have to avoid any permanent structure on the flood fringe or the terrace of the river. So losses from floods can be significantly reduced by removing the encroachment on the floodplains and regulating the land use. So generally we do restrictive land use on the flood fringe, and we avoid any concrete structure because the extent of the largest flood expected, we think that even in 100 years the return flow period could be 100 years, but within 100 years there could be damage to these permanent structures. So we should avoid any hard infrastructure, or we create in our master plan uh, on depending upon the return period, the 100-year flood return period or 50-year, we demarcate those areas which are required for different land use, for example parks or the open areas or gardens, or zone O in the master plan, which is for gardens and open areas. So if you have settlements on the floodplain, your entire flood hydrology is altered. So this is the river cross section. First step in zoning is define floodplain zones by having the flood fringe and the no development zone, where you have the return period of 2 to 10 years. Then you have the regulated zones where some activity is allowed, but in a regulated manner. You regulate that activity, and generally these areas correspond to a 10-year return period of flood. So floodplain zones are to be defined taking into account the topography and the high flood levels, the water levels like the warning level, the danger levels, and other site specific conditions. The second step is to have the modeling of the flood. We have different softwares like Mike 21, HEC 2D, where we do 2D hydrodynamic model, and which we simulate to find what would be the corresponding flood levels to a return period in a given river. So this sort of modeling is also done, flood frequency analysis, but there are some limitations, there are some overestimation, there are some embankments, and there are high dependency on the dam quality digital elevation model. But satellite approach is also quite good. We have the water extent, the water recurrence and water seasonality. So water recurrence counter is there. We take the satellite pictures of last 3 decades, and we see that what was the flood inundation, what was the wetted area, and what was the recurrence period of that wetted perimeter. So depending upon the recurrence and submergence and seasonality, we create a map of floodplain zones. But again, this has a some limitations. Some satellite pictures may not be that of that scale, and again it will underestimate, and it is very difficult to segregate the riverine flooding from other types of flooding. So we take a mixed approach, the hybrid approach, both models and satellite, and both satellite and model results are combined together to get the optimal extent of the floodplain zones. That is done in defining. And thirdly, we do ground truthing. We verify the results. Any deviation from the results must be noted down and verified. So depending upon these zoning, we create floodplain zone maps, and we create regulated zones and no development zones within the floodplain maps. But floodplain zoning is a state subject. Every state, the land is a state subject, And floodplain zoning is basically the land use categories of the lands. So the central government can only give some advices or advisories or guidelines, prescribe some guidelines. So land is a state subject under entry 18 of this too, and therefore the states, I will not cover this aspect because this is taken care by another expert who would be talking about the floodplain zoning, how exactly we have progressed in terms of guidelines from model build to the current NMCG guidelines. So I'll skip these two slides. And this is the floodplain zoning, which was done by the Central Water Commission from responding to a directive by the Honorable NGT. NGT asked the Central Water Commission to mark the floodplain from for the entire Ganga River, but they have done from Haridwar to Unnao, and different donations are given. But there are also some isolated cases of regulation, like in Maharashtra, in Noida, in UP, the Noida recently, Noida authority demolished illegal farmhouses on the riverbed, and that was almost 1,20,000 square feet of construction was happening, and somebody filed a complaint, some farmers, that there was encroachment on the Yamuna floodplain. But here there was no guideline because the state has not formulated the state floodplain zoning bill or act. So they had to use different act, that is Uttar Pradesh Industrial Area Development Act. And within this act, there is a provision that no construction, no industry, no settlement should come up within the floodplain areas. Similarly, in 2024, the NGT directed UP to submit a report on demarcation of floodplain of two rivers, Varuna and Assi. They are the tributaries of the Ganga River in Varanasi, and but still under process. There are many office orders in UP that clearly spells out that you have to remove encroachment on the floodplain and regulate the land use within it. I can give you, uh, I have summarized different office orders starting from the chief secretary. If you see the first order, 2007, obtaining the consent of irrigation for any check dams or any obstruction. Then similarly in 2010, again from Chief Secretary, effective prevention of illegal construction, encroachments in floodplain zones of rivers. So similarly, there were many office orders from the state government, from the Secretary, Irrigation and Water Resources Department, from Chief Secretary, from Special Secretary, and recently there was this order of floodplain demarcation. What happened? The Gomti River, which is a tributary of the Ganga River, it is a 960-kilometer river, and this is a plain-fed river. It doesn't get any water from the snow melt. It gets water from all its tributaries and the groundwater as base flows. But there was no floodplain defined, and a lot of cases were coming up. So we took up this matter with the state government, and after a lot of persuasion, the floodplain was defined. But here, uh, there was a blanket 100-meter, just like if you see this office order, that from origin to confluence to the river Ganga, 100 मीटर has been defined as floodplain, and किसी भी प्रकार के निर्माण, अतिक्रमण, व्यवसायिक गतिविधि, पट्टे, नीलामी, प्रदूषण करने वाली गतिविधियों को रोके जाने हेतु फ्लड प्लेन जोन निर्धारित किया जाता है. So they from this office order, 100-meter on both sides of the channel, the river channel, and the 100 meters from both sides was defined as floodplain. But this order just came last year. Similarly, there was this order from the Commissioner's Lucknow division, and I am also in this committee as an expert, technical expert on river rejuvenation. If you see this point number 6, from this order, समिति के द्वारा छोटी व सहायक नदियों के 2 किलोमीटर की परिधि के अंतर्गत शासकीय भूमि या नदी क्षेत्र का चिन्हांकन करना तथा अतिक्रमण से मुक्त कराने हेतु कार्रवाई सुनिश्चित करना. दैट मीन्स वी हैव टू मैप what is the extent of encroachment on these smaller rivers up to 2 kilometer, on both sides. So there is a buffer of 2 kilometer, and the state,
Professor, can
the
you
yeah.
go to the slide? We are seeing some separate slide. So you have to move to that slide.
Just a second. Can you see now? There is this office order.
No, we
Uh,
can.
maybe there is some delay in. But anyways, am I audible?
Yeah, you are audible. This is Gomti
So
River.
the idea is that no, but I'm already on the next slide.
Please shift to the next slide.
Yeah, can you see now the table?
No, table is after this.
Yeah. But okay, now tell me, can you see the picture of a river stretch?
No, I think you have to go down actually.
Just a second.
Want us to share, then we can share.
So if you could share, then maybe you could go to slide number 25. So I should stop sharing.
Yeah, please stop sharing. Pradeep, can you share, please?
Can you go to slide 25?
Yeah.
So the idea was that how to define floodplain for smaller rivers, because we have defined for large rivers like Ganga and Yamuna. Ganga is also not complete. We have done only till Unnao, from Haridwar to Unnao. So smaller rivers have been left, and there are large scale encroachments on smaller rivers. If I could give you the example from UP, we have more than 1,40,000 kilometers of networks of smaller rivers. The total length of smaller rivers in UP alone is 1,41,000 kilometers. And if you see the extent of encroachment, it is huge. So whenever we go for rejuvenation, our first challenge is to get rid of encroachment, whether it is from farming activities, terrace farming, or just close to the margin of the channel, the stream. So this is the biggest challenge: how to get rid of encroachment on the floodplains. Can you go back, come back to this next, next, next. Next slide. Yeah. So this is the office order. And in this office order, the point number 6 says that the state government should ensure that there is no encroachment on 2 kilometers buffer from all these smaller rivers. And the technical committee has been made in just March 2024. Next. So these are some cases. We did some experiment. We asked the farmers to even, you know, uh, just give some area along the rivers close to the river channel, and they were quite happy to not cultivate very close to the river channel, because the channel was quite narrow, just 10 to 20 kilometers. We asked the farmers to live at least some 50-60 meters on both sides, and the results were dramatic. Natural vegetations came, and water also started coming. Next. So I will not take much time. So these are the figures that you see, the result of in-stream habitat improvement. So we are doing a lot of habitat improvement by just removing even the terrace, what you call the bank farming, which is quite bad. When you start tilling, all the vegetations are removed. So at least 50 meters to 100 meters, you have to make a even no farming zone. Do farming only in special cases when there are no tilling, there are no removal of the vegetation. Next. So these are some of the pictures of a dry and wet phase of a river where we are trying to rejuvenate. Next. Teddy River. Then smaller rivers, there was this order. I have already talked about this order by the chief secretary. There's a rejuvenation of 75 rivers. A committee was also formed wherein it was directed to identify the government land and the river areas located within 2 kilometers of small and tributary rivers, and ensure action to free it from encroachment. This is the biggest challenge. Many cases it is very difficult to cancel the lease, the patta. The land of the river was given on lease for farming, but we have not cancelled the lease for 30-40 years. And once the lease is continued for 30-40 years, it is very difficult to cancel the lease. So this is the big problem that we are currently facing. Next. And one another problem, that we are creating concrete river fronts within the active floodplain. These are the pictures from Gomti River, and you could see how the channel was narrowed, and a concrete channel was made, a huge concrete diaphragm wall was made within the active flowing fluvial pathway of the river. Next, you could see the extent of encroachment within the channel itself. Next. So as a thumb rule, you have to create some buffer areas, riparian buffer areas, even for smaller streams. For Ganga River, we have kept 200 meters. For Gomti River, we have kept 100 meters. But for right now, I am drafting a report for smaller rivers. So we did some research work on what could be the recommended buffer width of a river, and we come across several recommendations. So at least 30 to 50 meters of buffer width must be kept even for smaller rivers, for smaller channels. So whenever we go for restoration work, so we create that buffer, the fluvial buffer, and we create that floodplain vegetation, natural vegetation. Next. So these are some of the pictures. Kukrel River, we are doing restoration of this 30-kilometer channel. It is a tributary of Gomti River in Lucknow, but one part is highly fragmented, and a lot of encroachment started happening after 80s. Next, and the state government is having a tough time to remove these settlements on the edge of the river, because these are also prone to flooding whenever this basin is quite unique, because the basin is small and the catchment size is also quite large, like 192 square kilometer. But since there are no major tributaries, so the flux of runoff is very high, and within 1 to 2 hours the river could be flooding. So these settlements are very hazardous, in terms of their risk to inundation. Next. These are some of the pictures. You could see that on the convex side, there's a huge encroachment on the river. So this was termed as Nala in the revenue record, but we restored it back, at least in the record, that now it is a river, and we have to, relocate these people to safer places so that they could be prevented from any flooding hazards. Next. So finally, I would conclude that first of all, you have to establish the floodplain zones and identify areas which are prone to flooding. And this must be done immediately, because we are losing the floodplains by every day. Every day there is some encroachment. And there has to be policy provisions. There are master plans, there are different land use categories, but we need to classify land according to the risk posed by floodplains. And we have to also take care of the ecology, the fluvial ecology, because they are not valued. You only value the flooding hazard, but what about the groundwater recharge? What about the habitat? What about the fluvial functions? So they have to properly incorporate it in the master plans, and we need strong regulation for obtaining any clearances for all proposed construction in the floodplain area. Generally, what happens, if government agency is planning for any highways or any corridor, then they get EC, they get environmental clearances. So, so even for the government agencies, there should be strong regulation. There should be someone, like in the floodplain zoning bill, we have a space for zoning authority. So some authority for giving all clearances. Next, I think this is the last slide. There is a mention in the Bradharma Puran, and this is in Sanskrit. They have even defined the Ganga corridor, and they say that कि भाद्र मास की कृष्ण चतुर्दशी, that means during the monsoon, जहां तक गंगा का जल जाए वहां तक गंगा का गर्भ जानना चाहिए. That means that is the bed of the river, और उसके पहले तीर होता है, और ये तीर 150 हाथ के बराबर होता है. 150 हाथ जहां तक जा रहा है, और तीर से जो चारों तरफ 2 कोस का क्षेत्र वो फ्लड प्लेन है, और इस फ्लड प्लेन में किसी भी तरह का कोई भी गंगा के विरुद्ध काम नहीं करना चाहिए. सो इवन इन आवर एंशिएंट टेक्स्ट we find some reference to floodplain zoning and mapping. So thank you so much for giving time.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
So, few of the points, key takeaways, we find that we were really fascinated to know that UP has been sending orders since 2007 and the orders are coming mainly from the Chief Secretary Office. That is very fascinating. And your work which talks about the buffer width 30 to 40 meters, even for a small river, that is quite appreciated. And the last slide, which talks about your way forward, which is very important, which you are talking about identify the areas which are prone to flood, which is very important. Even when we are in Delhi, we face this problem. And also the policy part, and also in the master plan where you are talking about that the zoning, proper zoning and land use plan should be in place. So that is why we are saying that the draft 2041 plan should be like talking about which are the buildings to be regulated and which are not to be regulated, and a strong regulation in place for the clearance process, even if it is for the government institutions. So we know that the NGT, which is the Green Tribunal, they have asked the DDA to actually demarcate the Yamuna floodplains on 100-year return period, which you have also talked about. So very well appreciated presentation, as we can see, and a very good work you are involved in. So we are next coming to Professor Rawal, Professor Pratap Manohar Rawal, who is from COEP Technological University, and who will be talking on the existing policies. So Professor Datta brought up the different orders which UP is actually giving. He talked about the issues what UP is actually facing from small rivers and big rivers, because the main Ganga, the national river, flows through that state. Now we go to Professor Rawal, who will be talking on the policies and the plans and the practices. We need to know right now, Professor Rawal, are we going to get back our floodplains? Can we prevent this urban flood? So it's very important that we know what are the existing policies or acts or regulations. And he will also talk about the Maharashtra, how Maharashtra is facing the problem. We have heard about Delhi, we have heard about UP. Now let's talk about another state, very important state, Maharashtra, how it is facing the issues. So over to you, Professor Rawal, and my colleague will be sharing your presentation. Please try and by 15 minutes, Professor Rawal, so that we have
good afternoon. It's a warm afternoon. In fact, the temperature in Pune itself is 40 degrees Celsius now. The first speaker, that is Professor Datta, of course, he has narrated very detail about the floodplains, and there is some repetition will be there, but I'll try to avoid that also. So I will be talking about existing policies, plans, and practices for floodplains. So please, next slide, please. So my presentation will include national and state policy for floodplains, then what are the international practices, and then what we need is about the adaptive planning. And then I'll speak about some of the recommendations also. So next slide, please. Okay, if you see the flood scenario, out of 36 states, 21 state and union territory, they are affected. And within that list, if you see Maharashtra, Assam, and Madhya Pradesh, these are the three states which are, top state affected by flooding. And it is in terms of all this human loss, housing damage, crop damage, etc. So these data provided by Ministry of Home Affairs, dated that is 6th August 2022. So if you look at that, Maharashtra's location and the flood prone area, they are mostly in the Western Ghat area. So I'll talk about that also. Next slide, please. So at the policy framework, I think Professor Datta also mentioned about that. Ministry of Water Resources in 1975 actually drafted model bill and then circulated to the state also, so that they can form a legislation. But I think again the land and the flood is a state subject, so very few states actually enacted. So to note that Manipur long back in 1978, Uttarakhand in 2012, they formed these act actually prudently. Then I think in 2008, National Disaster Management Authority also issued the guidelines for the state also about the flood zoning, and which is more like a non-structural measure to mitigate the flood. But again, the same thing that these guidelines are suggestive and non-binding to the state. And some of the state, of course, took forward also. Maharashtra government also created a norms to regulate all these floods and floodplains, and then also about talking the prohibitory zones in the floodplain of its river. So thereafter, actually, the flood lines, that is red and blue lines, were marked mostly. Almost all rivers are now completed. Next slide. So again, 2021, Niti Aayog also formulated some guideline also and the strategy for the country, whole country. And again, the same recommendation was that floodplain zoning is required, and some kind of non-structural measures also required. So if you look at the flood history, starting from 2005, Maharashtra has affected a lot, like Mumbai, my city also, and some of the city in Western Ghat area. So a recent flood, which was in 2019 in Western Maharashtra, where two cities like Sangli and Kolhapur got affected. And as we know that once some disaster happens, then government immediately set up the committee and try to find out what are the causes and all. So same in 2020. They formed the committee, and then committee again mentioned that it's not just the fury of the nature which break the havoc, but it is also largely human interventions in the riverine and stream system. As earlier presentation also said that a lot of encroachment and which is happening in the riverine system, which is causing a flood. So in fact, they also recommended to zoning authority in this Sangli and Kolhapur district. And they also gave a power function duties to regulate the land uses in these floodplains. So there are a lot of provision about restricting, prohibiting, reviewing the all these obstructions in the natural drainage. And they also recommended that this act, Maharashtra Irrigation Act 1976, there are some provisions about the floodplain protection. So they recommended that clause 16 also to be amended also. Next slide, please. So we have this typical problem that fragmentation of institutions, because there are many institutions involved dealing with the water, and we have that fragmentation. So we actually work in the silos. So these institutions, there are many institutions. For example, in Maharashtra, there is a soil conservation department. There is also a groundwater department. There is also surface water. So these all works in the silos also. In fact, the World Bank also suggested long back in 2015 that some reforms are required, at the valley base. So mainly these surface water and groundwaters are very important, but they are working in the silos. And then there are large urban agglomeration. Like for example, Mumbai is there, Pune. Pune's agglomeration itself is 6,000 square kilometer. So there is a lot of development is going to happen in this, and this is already on path. And a lot of land use changes, that is the land cover changes are proposed. So that is one of the important aspect which actually is responsible for the flood also. And they are not part of any water management coordination. So that is the sad part in our actually water management system. Next slide. So coming back to international experiences, when we see that non-coordination and everything in the Indian context, let's see about some of the best practices which are there. Netherlands, of course, people know about that. It's a small country. Area is almost similar to the Punjab state, but they have this room for river approach, and many researchers study this approach. What they have done actually is spatial planning, that is whatever we call as a master planning or all, and flood risk management. These issues are actually taken up together, and they have also national adaptation strategy also. So being a small country, they can do that, and then they have a delta plan. which is spatial adaptation under the National Delta Program. So they have embedded into Water Act also, and their Spatial Planning Act, which also talks about all. So they have gone through various flood events, and the first, which was a devastation flood, that is in 1953, where North Sea, storm surge was there, and a lot of land got inundated. In fact, the Netherlands itself, 26% of the land is below sea level, so they have to all the time protect the land. So, but they have managed very magnificently. So, Dutch adopted flood management long back, and many other countries also try to study their approaches. So, this flood risk approach is a multi-layer, and which has got the security also in adaptation, as well as in addition to prevention of the measures, preventive measures like flood risk reduced to spatial planning and urban design of the city. So they have actually novelly integrated this spatial planning and design in the flood management. That is also, they call it as a water management. So next slide. If you look at the left side table, which talks about organization, their tasks and the function. So they and the financing, of course. So in case of area like Rotterdam, they made it this it's like a public-private partnership also. So there are organization, and there is also finances available to all these organizations. So primary flood protection, of course, for the major rivers in the Netherlands itself is, or again the storm surge, because the country is located on the North Sea area. So it has to be handled by national government also, and the finance by the state general fund. So that is there. So 5 organizations actually got involved into whole this water management. That is the National and State Water Services under Ministry of Infrastructure and Water Management. Then there is also province, like we call it the state, province of South Holland. Then there are some water board also. 2 water boards are involved in whole plan. Then there are also public and some semi-public companies, water companies are there. So they were also part in this program. And then also Rotterdam municipality. So these all 5 organizations works together to prepare this water plan. Next slide. So this slide is actually water management policy. How did they evolve from learning the experience of 1953 and to date? So they have all constantly changing their approaches. So it's not only a flood risk, but then water management, then also spatial planning, then also recently they are looking into climate action. So climate changes, which are, we all know that, which is causing a lot of disturbances. So they brought this climate change as a, they have a ministry also for climate change. So they are looking into very integrated manner. So this policy of water management is constantly evolving, and the new approaches are also brought till today. Next slide. So this is another example, which is also similar to the Netherlands, which is called as Singapore example. What they have done is that they have long-term strategic initiative. Of course, Singapore is a small, state, actually, a country, very small area, but they have the similar approach of source, pathway, and receptor. A lot of literature is available, but the practices they adopted and their results are good. So one is that what they have done strategic way, it means that there will be some result. So all the drains, canal, and reservoir, they brought it, and they think that it's aesthetically pleasing. So we need a clean flow also, streams and rivers and lakes. So their approach to managing all this water. Then they also bring, they want to bring these people closer to the water. So it's also aesthetic also, but it is also, we know that all the people will have a good relationship water, so they can cherish, and then they can take ownership of water also. And then a seamless blue-green network, well integrated with the adjacent development they have done. So that's a other approach, that once the water fall down from that end to when it meet again to the sea, all land area, all development they have considered. Next slide. So it's not only a lack of rainfall, but for Singapore, actually lack of space to capture all this water. And we know that they are very water parched country. They have to depend on the Malaysia to get the water also. And so they are looking at that how they can maximum possible use their land for that. So they made it 1972 water master plan for whole country, and also catchment policy for development. So at the catchment level, they also work. And again, they are overlooked by development of catchment area and reservoir to collect the water to boost the local water supply also. So drainage master plan, which is developed then in close consultation with the other agencies. Here the question of coordination comes now. So coordination between the three entities like Urban Redevelopment Authority, Housing and Development Board, and then also Jurong Town Corporation. So three entities working together to make this drainage master plan. So they are now preparing for the extreme event also because of the climate change, intense and extreme event. So to cope up with all these intensive rainfall. So their National Water Agency again looking into this source pathway receptor approach to to be refined to look into the changes. Next slide. Yeah. So catchment-wide solution is one of the advocated by many researchers also, and that has been practically implemented in these countries like both Netherlands and Singapore. And higher level of flood protection is possible with this approach, and also holistic because they are making the system flexible, adaptable, addressing not just drains also, but the canals and then the stormwater travel, that is whatever the pathways are there, but also area where stormwater runoff is generated, that is the source where it is coming. And flood may occur, so which is also is a kind of a receptor. So idea of multifunctional in Singapore, urban spaces for flood management is advocated. And we know that people visit the Singapore to see all these urban spaces very beautifully designed. So framework which actually serve to guideline or the guide this enhancement of all these existing natural asset, and the development of residential landscape is to enhance the livability. We know that as a planner, we always work to enhance the livability, but all these element is taken together, they are looking towards the livability. So this whole framework, water framework guidelines are actually, for the flood hazard mitigation, and then also designing the multifunctional green and open spaces. So we know that the space has to be utilized, judiciously. So and the space is also shortage. That is, the land is also shortage in case of country like Netherlands or maybe Singapore. So they have to use the multifunctional use of whatever land allocated for some use. So sport field, outdoor way of incorporating all these basketball courts and paved plazas is all multifunctional. So to function in during the emergency, that is flood emergency, they act as a basin to retain the water or a storm event. Next slide, please. So coming back to the country from our place, yes.
Yeah, 5 minutes more.
Okay. So if you look at the Indian case, I'm just talking about the sub-basin. Pune and other agglomeration is a part of the upper Bhima river basin. It's a basin on the western side. So Sahyadri Hill Mount ranges, and these two rivers are actually flowing through the city. And the third one is also on the edge, but it is part of the another municipal council or municipality. So river originate from the all these Sahyadri ranges, that is part of, and then they traverse towards the basin, and then this upper river basin goes to the Bhima, and then it's Krishna river basin. So altogether 22 kilometer of Mula river, that is one of the river, and the other river is of 10.4 Mutha river. So and then they meet together. Actually, they meet near to my institute itself, and then they flow together, which ultimately goes to Bhima river. Next slide, please. So this is the part of the actually catchment, and you will find that the whole these rivers are flowing, and these are all the streams which are connected to that. So this floodplain actually, as earlier said, that they are depositing the silts and sediment along the bank, but now whole area is urbanized. So I'll show you. Next slide, please. If you look at this area now, this is all covered now. So almost 49%, and beyond that it is going to get covered because of the development plan. So we call it as a development plan in Maharashtra, but in other states they call it the master plan. So it's all human development. The land is covered. So next slide. So if you look at this heavy urbanization for the decade is going on, and from 1956 when the first plan was prepared, and then all this construction activity which is actually altering the topography, drainage pattern, geomorphic environment, all they are happening, and which is causing the flood on the land and also in the river also. So this negative impact on physical environment is lot, that is already loss of agricultural land, then surface and groundwater depletion, and that all these changes are happening continuously. Next slide. So we need actually some kind of a adapted planning approach. That is, we know that the climate change is not the future, but it's here, it is there, and all we are facing. So we have to look into the map preparation, which will look into the integration of land elevation, permeability, and all these aspects, which is actually missing. So we can do a hydrodynamic assessment of all these areas, and then we should put up the flood vulnerability analysis of all these areas, and then overlay this map to find out flood prone areas also within that, and then we can integrate with the socio-economic indicators such as number of low income households which are living nearer to the all the streams and river, and they also other things like a critical infrastructure. So we need to actually look beyond the spatial planning and regulating the development and the land uses through master plan also. Next slide, please. So these three important aspects. One is that looking at the projections, that is we can have a local projection of the climate also. Similarly, we can also look into the vulnerable population asset, mapping all these things, and then deciding or determining the city's flood adaptive capacity. So that's the one thing which is for the flood management in any urbanized catchment. Next slide.
So Professor Rawat,
okay. Yeah, within 2-3 minutes, I'm just at the end of that. So this is one that one can look into developing future climate projection at local level also by using various methods also. Next slide. And then mapping all these vulnerable asset also from site to region level also. These are the methods also. I just shown it through this analytical diagram also. Next. And then this is in case of Pune, just we actually mark the which are the flood zones. So using GIS analysis, one can do also with the satellite image, and the blue is a high risk zone for the Pune city, and the others are moderate and no risk zone. So next slide, please. So looking at that, we need to adapt it. So spatial planning is one that is we are actually changing the whole land pattern. So we need to see that how does this spatial planning play the important role in actually looking at the land and actually bring all the other stakeholders together to plan this area when we are looking at the floods also. Next slide. So one can actually find out the integrating with the underground water also. So if we have a aquifer map, we can actually integrate. So we try to find out that where are the recharging zone, where it is possible. So through different type of GIS analysis, one can find out that where we can actually put up the water, because the underground water cycle is an important part in the whole flood management. Next slide, please. So if you see the right side, these are the aquifer map of Pune city. So where we can actually integrate this map with this map, and then decide upon what kind of land use zoning is required actually from the point of view, because we know that we are dependent on underground water, and underground water table is going down and down because we are not allowing water to percolate, because a lot of it goes to the flooding only. Next slide. So if you see that the permeability is important aspect in any flood management. So there are regulation actually in Singapore where for 2-hectare development, how much permeable area they should do or keep it into the whole boundary. All these are there, and we also require such type of regulation, because large scale development of the land, that is which actually becomes impermeable when we put up a lot of infrastructure, housing, and other things. So we need that actually, looking at that aspect of underground water. Next slide. So in the conclusion, what I will say is that we have very poor regulation actually in case of river floodplain, and the Floodplain Protection Act must be enacted by all the states. So even the Maharashtra is not enacted yet. This protection actually is better done through the river basin approach. So many researchers are saying, and many case studies are showing, that the river basin level approach are very important to actually implementing the floodplain zoning, and also integrated flood management, which is also shown by other cases like Rotterdam and the Netherlands also. So both the cases are saying that we should include the spatial planning to address the flood, and that is missing in current policy also. So Indian context also, we must actually look into the underground water resource as an important aspect, because we are not taking that during the preparation of master plan also. So we can have better result if we actually also bring the public participation, which is very important. And this master plan or development plan must be based on the watersheds and aquifer locations, and then the zoning and other uses has to be assigned. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Raval. That was a very detailed presentation where we actually understood the main issues are, you have mentioned, as you have mentioned, if we take the key takeaways, fragmentation of institution, which you have said, and the land uses that are being proposed. And we had a very good understanding of the Netherlands approaches, which talks about the spatial planning, and you are also giving priority to the river basin approach. And we were like, you have very well explained the Pune city, the example of Pune city, which is like 49% of it has been approached, and how the step by step we can move towards flood retention and avoid urban flooding in the cities. All the points have been well taken, and now we come to Mr. Rajesh Ramakrishnan, who is a member of Indian Community Activist Network. And he is actually going to talk from, we have the academia talking about what is a floodplain, how, what are the impacts due to the encroachment, and what can be done. But we want a take from the NGO point of view, which Mr. Rajesh Ramakrishnan is going to give us. And he is also going to tell us in detail how Chennai is actually losing its floodplain. So over to you, Mr. Rajesh Ramakrishnan. Please.
Thank you, Sushmita and the CSE team for this opportunity. It's a hard act to follow, 2 great presentations. Let me share my screen.
Please make it full screen.
Yeah. Is that clear?
Yeah.
Okay. So my slides are plain vanilla. Sorry about that. So what I had planned to do was again to look at the constitutional position, law, policy, and institutions, then to come to civil society policy initiatives, then to move on to the case of Chennai, and finally to try to conclude and look at what alternative paradigms could mean. Since the previous 2 speakers have covered most of the initial part about the constitutional position, I will skip these slides and come to civil society. Yeah. So some of the civil society policy initiatives that I have looked at are these: the Delhi Declaration of the India Rivers Forum, the Rally for Rivers, draft policy recommendations, the intact guides to naturalizing the riverfront, and most recently, the National Alliance of People's Movements River Valley Forum. They have drafted an act on river protection, conservation, and rejuvenation. Now, there is no time to discuss these rich documents in full. But for example, the India Rivers Forum Declaration says the river needs space to accommodate floods. That space must be determined with reference to the 100-year return flood and left free to the river. The Rally for Rivers document says that a minimum lateral distance of 1 kilometer from the river should be demarcated and declared as an ecologically sensitive zone. The draft legislation of NAPM calls for the establishment of a river basin authority with 2/3 of its members non-government and drawn from statutory organizations, civil society organization, communities of various occupational categories, the river basin, and subject experts. Now, civil society policy statements have brought back the river as an integrated entity in all its dimensions, in place of the state's view of the river as a source of water for irrigation and power. This is a much needed corrective. However, the entire legal and institutional edifice of the state is still largely built around land as private property and water as a corollary of land. The larger vision is one of unlimited national economic growth through market-oriented agriculture and industry, where water from rivers is an input. The preservation of ecology is still subservient to this larger goal. The subsistence-oriented economies of riverine communities like small farmers, forest dwellers, fishers, and pastoralists simply does not figure in this scheme of things. Our civil society visions and principles are forward-looking and egalitarian, but they tend to wish away the current gross imbalance of wealth and power manifested in the water footprint of industries and ever-growing cities. Our civil society alternative policy statements also run the danger of being just a collection of general statements without detailed analysis and reflection on very local complexities. The study of the working of local level alternative models yields important learnings. After studying various NGO initiatives of building local level institutions around streams, small rivers, and tanks, the South Asia network of dams, rivers, and people identified that despite all their drawbacks, these local efforts built on the knowledge base of local users evolved various technological options locally and evolved local regulatory and monitoring mechanisms to manage the river system through user groups. Community-based knowledge systems. Community-based knowledge systems have evolved through generations based on trial and error methods in use of resources. This knowledge is intricately linked with sociocultural and economic dimensions of the community. The locally evolved technological options were successful because the community could plan and manage with the available resources, physical, financial, manpower, and management. Though many of these community-based institutions manage resources through traditional hierarchy and authority, many also form part of the increasingly contested political domain. Let me now turn to a larger and a more unequal scale and the complexity of local issues, which is illustrated by the city that I am living in for the past 4 years, Chennai. Chennai is naturally flood prone, as the entire city was built on the floodplains of 3 rivers, the Adayar, the Kuam, and the Koshishtalayar. The Adayar and the Kuam run through the south and central parts of the city respectively, and their floodplains are almost entirely built up. The Koshishtalayar River along the city's northern edge meets the sea at the Ennore estuary. It is the city's largest river and has a sprawling backwater that extends all the way to Pulikat Lagoon. Now, cyclones occur between October and December during the northeast monsoon, bringing with them gale force winds, tidal surges, and high rainfall. The city has its natural defenses against storms and flooding. On the south and north, the Kovalam and Ennore creeks. On the south, the Pallikarnai marshlands. The beaches and dunes with vegetation like spruce pine and palmyra retard violent storms, soak up fresh water, and prevent seawater intrusion into the groundwater. Estuaries and salt marshes with mangroves buffer floodwaters and regulate their exit to the sea. In the pre-industrial era, the areas that now make up Chennai were settled as temple towns and agricultural villages, either around naturally occurring wetlands or by carving out irrigation tanks called as eri in the gently undulating floodplain. Eris mitigate floods and improve water security by storing rainwater and recharging groundwater, and approximately 650 water bodies existed in the Chennai region. Then there was Porombuk, the unassessed lands reserved for communal and public use, including commons, such as cremation or burial grounds, lakes, tanks, rivers, forests, grasslands, racing grounds, the margins of roads, water bodies, and the sea. These Porombuk lands allowed rainwater to infiltrate and to recharge aquifers, thereby regulating floods. Now, Chennai's vulnerability to floods has been directly linked to the disruption of the natural drainage system and the encroachments of the catchment areas. With rapid urbanization and urban sprawl, the synergy between the natural water bodies, catchment areas, river systems, marshlands, and human-made dams was undermined due to encroachment by residential and institutional development, industries, and informal settlements. The overall region became increasingly vulnerable to floods, with the water carrying capacity of the natural drainage system severely compromised. The primary reason for this unprecedented urbanization was the systematically unplanned urban development process. Economic growth has been one of the primary goals of Tamil Nadu since the liberalization of the economy in 1991. The inflow of foreign direct investment into Chennai and development of its industrial sector by setting up SEZs has led to Chennai becoming an automobile, industry, and IT hub. The famous IT corridor along the old Mahabalipuram road was set up in 2005. Industrial nodes were developed across the region, triggering urban sprawl around these nodes. And driven by the ambition to become a global city, the master plan drafted by the Chennai Metropolitan Development Authority in 2006 favored fast economic development. This resulted in strong emphasis on land and real estate development, causing a clash with the natural hydrological system of the region. The increase in demand for land resulted in the encroachment of land adjacent to water bodies, ponds, lakes, swamps, marshes, and these were dried and built upon. Large-scale industrial, residential, and commercial development was directed to flood-prone areas. There was a severe loss of wetlands and their ecosystem in the last 2 decades. The large Elcott ITSEZ and the Shiruseri ITSEZ set up by state-owned entities are located at important drainage points. The mass rapid transit system's elevated rail corridor runs through the Pallikarnai marshland. An extension to the second runway at the Chennai International Airport was built almost entirely on the Adayar riverbed. Now, only unlicensed structures are encroachments as defined by the law. In Chennai, the government is one of the biggest wetland encroachers. They and many other elite institutions and buildings have the licenses, and they are licensed encroachers. The poor, on the other hand, are pushed to build their huts on the margins of the sea, roads, rivers, and lakes. Their dwellings are mostly unlicensed. Their thatch and ramshackle constructions lack the structural tenacity to block or divert water flow. But the elite encroachments, on the other hand, are stronger, like the CMDA-approved layouts, the national and state highways, the IT special economic zones, the state-of-the-art transport corridors, all of which have legal sanction, but during the rainy season, they block and divert floodwaters. And after every flood or cyclone, the judiciary and the government resolve to rid the city's water bodies or the coast of encroachment. Now, which encroachment do they mean? After the tsunami, Chennai saw a massive eviction of 8,000 odd families. And then after the floods in 2015, we had, as the infographic shows, 19,200 families evicted till date. 80% of the settlements near the Kuvam have been evicted, and nearly 60% of the low-income settlements near the Adayar have been cleared, and now they are moving to the Buckingham Canal for further evictions. Now, resettlement has been done in far-flung areas without an assessment of land availability within the city itself. All these resettlement sites are far away from the city center, where the families originally stayed. They are low-lying. They are themselves in the path of flood. The design and quality of construction have been poor. In the last 77 slums that were evicted, only 5 slums had social impact assessments done. So the government does not know how many children they are evicting, where they are studying, what the employment profile of the women and men is. There is no employment near the resettlement sites, and people commuted long distances to go back to their original workplace. Daycare facilities were absent in the settlements. 90% of the evictions were carried out in the middle of the academic year. There were no schools in the resettlement sites. All the evictions and resettlement were done in the absence of a resettlement and rehabilitation policy, which was ultimately finalized only last December. And that policy facilitates arbitrary eviction rather than act as a safeguard against it. Now, north of Chennai lies the Ennore wetlands. The wetlands are important in maintaining the integrity of the groundwater reserves by keeping out saltwater intrusion from the sea. Given their large size covering a densely populated region, the Ennore wetlands are important for flood mitigation during heavy rain and storm surges through the northeast monsoon. And the wetlands also mean livelihood and identity for lakhs of people, several communities which live along the coast of Chennai and northern Tamil Nadu. From the 1960s onwards, Ennore Manali was rezoned by Tamil Nadu for petroleum, petrochemical, and coal-based industries in line with its vision of industrialization and modernization. By 1971, Ennore was home to a power plant and a large working-class population. The current master plan categorizes the Ennore Manali area as a zone for special and hazardous industries. After the 1960s, land uses began to change. The creek was re-engineered by roads, pipelines, and other forms of infrastructure. It was also used as a dump for pollutants, dredge material, and toxic wastes, frequently in violation of the state's own regulations and controls. Nearly 1,000 acres of salt pans were taken over for industrial infrastructure, reducing the flood carrying capacity of the wetlands. In 2001, the Ennore port was commissioned to handle the coal required by thermal power stations located on the creek, and its construction re-engineered the creek further and the shoreline, leading to blockage of the creek's mouth and compromising the creek's ability to discharge floodwater into the sea. And this had catastrophic consequences in the 2015 Chennai floods, when the Koshastalaya River inundated the northern parts of the city. The parcels of Ennore's wetlands were given to various developers over the years, like NTPC, Coal Yard of Kamarajar Port, the oil storage terminals of Bharat Petroleum and Hindustan Petroleum. The power transmission company has got 50 acres, including 17 acres of mangroves, and its transmission towers are entirely inside the river. Close to 2,000 acres of the river's space has been taken over for industrial real estate. 1,000 acres have been smothered with about 3 to 8 feet of coal ash discharged from the public sector power generating company. The local fisherfolk, men and women who enter the waters, have a high rate of skin disorders and other ailments. Their respiratory problems are very common because of the high levels of air pollutants, and these are confirmed even by studies of the State Pollution Control Board submitted to the NGT. The struggle to save the wetlands was mounted by the fisher communities themselves since the mid-90s, and it has become more prominent and visible after the intervention of solidarity groups from Chennai. For the fisherfolk, these comments are valuable. It is their source of livelihood and identity. They are saying that this land, the commons, should remain unbuilt and unowned, which means that it must remain in common trusteeship. These communities are the protectors and also users of the river, and it is they who have been arrayed against state government and others intent on destroying the wetlands. The fisher struggle has been in collaboration with city-based youth and solidarity organizations. There are 3 power plants which have been legally challenged by the communities, and all 3 projects have been temporarily suspended. The transmission towers have also been challenged, and 2 years ago, a case filed by the fishers resulted in the NGT defining the extent of the wetlands in line with what the fishers were saying and not what the coastal zone management map was showing, which was showing many areas of the river and wetland wrongly as land.
Mr.
The NGT asked, The NGT asked for the wetlands to be restored and notified. And these are significant legal victories, but they matter only if they can be enforced on the ground. And that requires communities and people from the privileged sections of society to push for enforcement. That's going to be another long fight. The Tamil Nadu government announced that the 3rd master plan for 2026 to 46 would adopt a flood-sensitive planning permission regime. The master plan area has been increased to almost 6,000 square kilometers from the current 1189 square kilometers. All the extra land will come from the neighboring districts of Chengalpat, Kanchipuram, Tiruvallur, and Ranipet. Agricultural wetlands and water bodies constitute a significant portion of the unbuilt lands in these districts. While the CMDA is arguing for expansion, citing that haphazard and unplanned growth is a threat in the absence of a master plan, critics are pointing to CMDA's failure in regulating the original 1189 square kilometers. And they say the expansion would be a recipe for a much larger and planned disaster. In the past 3 years, there has been a massive project of building stormwater drains all over the city to prevent flooding. But the flood carrying capacity of the Adyar River and the Koshasthalya River are definite. They are hard hydrological ceilings that the city has to reckon with. Paving over the natural rainwater harvesting infrastructures like water bodies and wetlands cannot be compensated for by human-made drainage structures. Micro drains can be only as effective as the capacity of major drains to receive their discharge. Now, there's a planned second international airport in Chennai, 4,500 acres in Parandur near Sriperumbudur, around 40 kilometers from the city, which is totally inappropriate due to the extent of wetlands it will impact. Nearly 90% of the site is either agricultural wetlands, Porambok water bodies, or other Porambok commons. These natural flood buffers were themselves overwhelmed by the rainfall in the 2015 flood that hit Chennai. Now, under the establishment of an airport, there will be a further increase in built-up area and land cover under impermeable surfaces. The airports will trigger further growth and urbanization when industries, hotels, and establishments spring up. Once again, there will be an engineering response to it to provide stormwater stormwater micro-drain networks and rainwater harvesting structures, which will prove to be inadequate. So, in conclusion, the lessons learned from the alternatives on the ground on river tank systems managed by user institutions, and the lessons learned from struggles such as in Ennur, they need to be synthesized. If we zoom out from our discussion topic of floodplains and speak in general about nature-based communities like farmers, fishers, forest dwellers, and pastoralists, all of them have commonalities in their need to access land, water, and forests, and to protect them against the over-extractive, large-scale interests backed by the state. The community's interests are opposed to the path of so-called development, which is based on relentless capitalist growth facilitated by the union and state governments. In our campaign to defend nature and people, the overarching principle that serves as the common guideline for the protection of nature and to address justice and equity for nature-dependent communities is what we call ecosystem-based human rights. Human rights are inviolable, but they have to be circumscribed by ecosystem processes. Similarly, protecting the ecosystem is important, but it cannot be at the cost of human rights. While we talk of ecosystem-based human rights, we know that mere rights talk is not enough. Looking at the fate of various rights legislations like NREGA, Right to Education, and the Forest Rights Act, we recognize that strong political movements are needed in which nature-dependent communities as well as urban support groups of citizens concerned about both ecology and justice participate. What we require is recognition of ecosystem-based human rights through constitutional amendments, new laws and amendments to laws, creation of new institutions to translate the rights into law and policy and to facilitate their implementation and realization, the establishment of measures to ensure government accountability to citizens for rights, and grievance redressal mechanisms. The ecosystem-based human rights approach is clearly contradictory to the present system of constant economic growth and capital accumulation through the destruction of nature and the exploitation of labor. Our politics is redistributive and egalitarian. Our politics is to build power to challenge those who control the economy today and destroy nature, to empower nature-dependent communities to secure their livelihoods and protect the resources of nature they depend on, and we also depend on, to redefine the very terms of production, distribution, and exchange for a more equitable world living in harmony with nature. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rajesh. The key takeaways are surely the Chennai case, which is very prominent, where you have said almost 2,000 acres of river space has been taken over, and mostly it's the industrial people who are and the real estate who are actually encroaching. And you have also made this point where the creeks have been encroached so that the flood water could not take its own course. So we had three excellent presentations. We have stretched our time and for a very valid reason. So before I will take some questions from the chat as well as from the Q&A panel. So there are a few questions which I would like to start with. Yeah, because Mr. Rajesh was the last one, so I am starting with him only. So where we are actually looking at how communities can be involved in this, decision-making process. There was a question on the chat for that. Can you please explain how communities can take part in it? I'll just read out the question. How can local communities be actively involved in decision-making processes and implementation of floodplain protection measures? This is Mr. Kumar.
Yeah, I mean, there is no shortcut to this because right now, whatever law and policy that we have are actually shutting out these communities. Nominally, you may talk of river basin organizations, you may talk of participatory institutions. But let's remember, these are highly unequal parties, unequal in wealth and power, who are expected to come and sit at a common table. And the results of that are not going to be equitable. But at the same time, wherever such opportunities present themselves, communities need to get organized and take advantage of them, to make use of these institutions, to make their voice heard, to get their foot in the door. And it is actually unfair to leave all this to the hands of communities themselves. We people who are privileged, who are living in urban areas, who have the background of education, need to learn from them. Because in Chennai, we learned about the value of wetlands, how wetlands protect the whole city from the fishers. We learned fighting spirit from the fishers. So involving communities means not in a patronizing way, but to recognize that they are the ones who are living on the land, on the resources, and they are the ones who are organizing to protect them. And in what way can we help them to do that?
So, okay, so we have another question for Professor Raval. So Amit Raj is asking, with respect to the RFD in Pune, could you comment on the situation of Pune Municipal Corporation is doing permanent construction? They are actually, he's trying to say that they are making some construction, permanent construction on the riverbed. So can you please comment? You are on mute. You are on mute, Professor Raval.
Okay, this question is regarding
how can you convince PMC?
Yeah, the riverfront development. He's asking about the riverfront development. I think Pune Municipal Corporation is actually destroying the river, to my opinion, and many actually NGOs and all, they are protesting because you can't construct something within the river, and which is totally contradictory to the the river plain or river floodplain policy. But since that is actually motto to actually put up this all 8,000 crore rupees just for the development. We know the politics also. But what we can do is that through the pressure also, we can actually reduce the damage also. Because once this local authority, which is having, political patronage also, so they will go for this development. So that is happening actually. I can see also in front of my institute also the rivers, how they are destroying the rivers. So they're making permanent constructions also.
Professor Datta, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
So someone, Mr. Pankaj Kaprawa, is asking that whether there is a formal policy in action for Yamuna floodplain maintenance in Delhi NCR area.
The NGT has made a committee last year with the chief secretary as a chairman, of Delhi, and the committee was asked to submit the report by end of January. So I'm not aware if the committee has submitted the report, but
No.
there is already a committee constituted by the NGT
Yeah.
for Yamuna floodplain.
Yeah, in October 2023, that committee
Yeah.
was, but till date, nothing has actually, some concrete results have come out actually. That is what NGT is telling. So there's another question for you, Professor Datta. Kindly confirm if Yamuna floodplains have been formally maintained by orders of government of UP.
Some cases of encroachment on river bed in Noida was removed by the UP government because the Noida comes under UP, and they cited this UP Industrial Act, something that I already referred in my presentation, because there is no floodplain zoning bill approved by the UP government yet. There are isolated office orders and there are some master plan regulations where category O is there in the riverbed, but usually these guidelines are not uh, put into practice. They are there, like NDMA, National Disaster Management Authority. They had come out with excellent floodplain management guidelines in 2008. They are even better than the model bill because it is more elaborate. The NDMA floodplain guidelines. So in some of the cities, in some of the areas like in near Hindan, in Ghaziabad, that is also being done by the UP government. But of course, these are some isolated cases. There is no holistic approach. It is more like a ad hoc approach of treating the problem whenever somebody cites or somebody files a petition. There should be an integrated approach. There should be a holistic approach, not on ad hocism, but more on scientific aspect of floodplain zoning, which is missing from the entire landscape, whether it is in Delhi or UP.
Okay. So we had some fascinating discussions. So let me tell you, we have lots of appreciation on the chat, and there are more suggestions, more questions, but we have stretched beyond the time. We have actually, we were supposed to end it at 4 o'clock, and we have actually overshooted that. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining, and we'll keep coming back to you for some more discussions on these lines, and see you soon. Thank you, experts. Thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sushmita and the CSE team. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.